but I'll introduce you first. All right. So I'm going to say a little bit about each of you all at once. I'll just introduce you all. And so I'm actually going to read what you sent me, so it should be accurate. But if you want to add anything or correct what I say, feel free. So I'll introduce the three of you, and then we'll invite Janelle, Manuela, Amanda to share. And what I had asked them to reflect on was what experiences, projects, ideas, questions does repair in a world of colonial settler racism bring to mind for you? And if you have any questions that you might want us to be thinking about as we have our conversations in the time to come. So, sitting beside me is Janelle Pewapsconais. She's a spoken word poet, social entrepreneur, and public speaker from Little Pine First Nation in Treaty 6 territory. Her educational background in land management and business gives her a unique perspective as Janelle utilizes her platform and innovative arts to write about Indigenous resilience, healing, and connection to land in her spoken word poetry practice. And can I also add how we first met? Yeah, we were in a sociology class back on campus some years ago. So it's wonderful to connect again. And Amanda Dodge is the program director at Mennonite Central Committee, Saskatchewan, which works actively towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in a faith context. Amanda has worked towards social justice alongside marginalized people in Saskatchewan for over 12 years. She has degrees in psychology and law from the University of Regina, the University of Saskatchewan, and Harvard Law School. And I'm just going to add a little how I met these folks, but I first heard you speak at an event that Georgina Sun had organized, and you spoke about love and community and about social justice and community. So that's where I first was alerted to you. Manuela Valle Castro is a feminist organizer and academic from Chile. She holds a PhD in gender, race, sexuality, and social justice, and an MA in Women's and Gender Studies from the University of British Columbia. Growing up in Chile under Pinochet's dictatorship shaped her views as an anti-neoliberal feminist, as well as her commitment for social justice and human rights in Latin America. And we've served on a committee together, Gender and Sexual Diversity on Campus. Yeah. So, welcome to the three of you, and I'll just invite Janelle to start.
Hello, everybody. Gagawe nawaski nasigasun. Manai gustis niauche. My name is Janelle Pewapsconais, and I come from Little Pine First Nation. And I am grateful for you for inviting me today here. It's definitely one of the first experiences that I get to share perspectives to a church-going group. It is different for me because I've spoken and shared words with other communities of faith and beliefs. So it's really interesting that you've brought me here. So thank you. I come from Little Pine First Nation. Again, my spirituality is Indigenous, or Nehio, most specifically. I've been in university for a number of years, like she said, a business and land. And I give that positioning of myself because that's really important to understand and where I'm coming from with my beliefs and my perspectives. I come from someone who has been impacted intergenerationally from residential school from my father's side, and luckily he ran away at the age of 12 and has not been to school since, and for good reason. He's been on his own, his rough and tumble, and I get a lot of his tenacity, I suppose, and stubbornness from my father. And my mother, she went to town school where it wasn't as impactful in a certain way, instead of but she has shared some stories of, having to punch a farmer guy out for calling her a squaw. So those are the kinds of instances she grew up with in high school. And so I get my feistiness from my mother, and also my lovingness from my mother as well. And I myself am a mother, And so when I seriously started thinking about the world and these educations that I've been given and or earned, I suppose, or have gone through, experienced, I began to, it shifted. It wasn't just an idea or a theory. It became real because now my child, and if he chooses to have offspring, their worlds are going to be impacted. My lineage is going to be impacted by the environment that I studied for years and understood that, we're kind of almost going down a very treacherous path in terms of environmental protection and the land. But having said that, it was interesting because at the same time I'm trying to learn and become, having that degree that people so think of highly of, that I needed to heal as well because of the traumas I've experienced. So as long as I was going through this Western science education, which I found quite easy because it was a system that I grew up with, but it's the healing part. I couldn't explain or put words to why certain things traumatized me or triggered me, why, when I went through my biology courses, I found it really disrespectful to life, and I couldn't put the language or words to it and why it bothered me so much until I started reading about Indigenous literature and from Indigenous people who have survived colonialism, who are thriving in this world that it wasn't always necessarily created for them to survive in, who have also been impacted from, horrible things like the residential school, from 60s scoop, from just colonialization and starvation in general. Those are all real impacts that have created me in this body, in this space. All of those stories, and even though they're not, my family directly, but they're my community. And that's how I grew up, was with community. And so that's part of my positioning of why I've come to think about communities and why we want to build relationships. It's because it feels good when it's all hunky-dory, hakuna matata. You do have some drama on occasion. No family is perfect or gets along very well, but being part of community is really important, and it's a way of undoing and decolonizing. So that's step one, I suppose. As a tip for all of us. How many people in your circle, even your second circle of friends or acquaintances, do you have are from the Black, Indigenous, peoples of color community? And if we don't have those peoples, well, then it's a good time to pull out the tea or coffee or distilled water. I don't know what people drink. And start making those relationships. Well, okay, going back. I'm currently involved in a few different things. Like I said, I've come from, those certain educational backgrounds. But my understanding of the world is that I'm trying to be a good person and a good ancestor. And I'm sure a lot of you can relate to, wanting to be a good person and doing good in the world. So a lot of my work gets to be able to do that. It's not work when it's your passion. And so I get to do Niche Up Games, and it's an Indigenous game company that I've created. I've yet to come to market because, student loans, that life. But also it's really interesting work because I get to go into learning spaces and play board games and card games and human-sized games, and even simple as when I'm working with grade ones tomorrow, we get to do a show, don't tell, and we get to act out feelings and how we would experience different sentences. And some of the sentences include I just been able to taste my first berry of the spring. That's an Indigenous way of knowing that children get to act. So, games like that give kids the experience to think a little differently and also act those out in safe spaces where our youth are working together. So those are some of the things. But some of the things that I've seen from it is that my favorite is working with inner city youth. And my favorite is because we talk a lot about stigma. And in the games, you do get stigmatized with these stigma labels. And it was quite a process to actually come up with 77 terms that were either discriminatory, racist, or laterally violent. But I filtered those down and came up with the, quote, best ones. And now when we play those games, these older youth, because definitely not children, the older youth get to experience what it's like to have those terms. The inner city youth actually take those terms and they make fun of it. They flip the script on those. And I really love seeing them get the humor, get the perspectives, and, see from, I don't know if I'm professional, but a professional person coming into those spaces to teach and just remind them who we are as Indigenous peoples. And that's really neat. And it's really also kind of interesting when we go into, non-Indigenous, primarily non-Indigenous high schools. Marion Graham, we went there a few weeks ago, and although I could say we're at about a junior high school level in terms of the knowledge, they were learning something with every question card they were doing, with every joke. And although they don't like being, teenagers, they don't like necessarily doing the dances and being called to the front of the room. They get to learn, and they also get to laugh and experience that. And I also get to challenge some of these beliefs that some of these youth have come up with. So that's really interesting, because already as young as like 12 years old, 10 years old, our young people have already internalized quite a bit of misinformation about Indigenous Black peoples of color, which is really unfortunate. We know we're doing our youth a disservice by teaching them misinformation, stereotypes, all that. So that's another tip I'm going to put forward to people, is observe our own, toxicity, I suppose. It's a hard lesson, to reflect and look at yourself. But some things as simple as gossip, some things as simple as snide comments, I observe that in Canadian society, and it's very uncomfortable. I'm going to say, as an Indigenous person, I witness those things, and it's uncomfortable, and it's microaggression, and it shouldn't exist. So building community means that we're taking a look at our own selves and how we're not building community by microaggressions. And another piece that I get to do, my favorite piece, is spoken word poetry. And I get to go into different spaces, and they have to listen to me. No, I'm just kidding. But no, I get to go in spaces and share my frustrations, but it's more than just that. When you're a poet, it's you put it in a way that other people can reach and feel it. It was with Idle No More, that's one of their poets that really just woke me up and made me have shivers all over my body and my arms. And that's when I knew that I connected to the message. So poetry is another really neat thing, which makes me think about how much we listen to each other, and how much we listen to each other and are able to converse over a cup of tea, distilled water, pot of coffee, or whatever. That's always something to think about. And giving people space to say their piece. I observe a lot of my people don't get a lot of space to share their story. So sometimes when it comes out, and I can say this the very first time I did a story of self, as it just all came out, blah, 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 blah. Everything, every trauma, every success, every smile, everything that made me. So if it took me, so giving me that space was able to be a jumping point in my success, ability to finish school, raise my child, do a TED Talk and have all these really interesting things. Just imagine what we can birth if we listen to other people with our open minds. And I know this sounds a lot like fluff. There's a lot more harder things that we can definitely be done. But it's definitely a starting point, is looking within. Because who do we have control of in this world? It's just ourselves. So that's definitely a good starting point. Yeah, and that's it for me.
Thank you, Janelle. So there's a lookout for Janelle online in terms of finding her spoken word poetry, and Niched Up Games. You can find info about the company that Janelle started that has Indigenous games. So thank you. Well, should we just move? Or
oh, I'm next. Okay. Hi, everybody. It's hard to follow the beautiful words of Janelle, who I also know from several instances, I guess. So thank you also for the invitation. It's also my first time sharing my story in a church or in a faith Christian-based space, which makes me kind of nervous. But I see other people with tattoos and weird haircuts, so I hope I don't look like such a freak to you. But I do have a story to share on the topic of repair and reconciliation. And I had like a thing written down, but I think I'm just going to speak to it. So my story is very different from Janelle's, a completely different story. But it's kind of interesting because it starts, this is really hot, no? Like the SS, like, okay. Okay. So I was born in 1974 in Chile. So if you know some kind of like history of Latin America, roughly, you would know that there was a CIA-backed coup, military coup, in 1973 to end with a project of democratic socialism that had been started in 1970 by Salvador Allende. So my parents were the generation that were pushing for all that change, and it was a moment of a lot of utopian dreaming around social justice, and it ended catastrophically with the U.S. intervention backed up by the national elites, a terribly, tragically violent coup, and then I was born right after that. And then we had to run away to Colombia for 5 years because part of my family went missing. I have an uncle who's still not found. And a lot of people went into exile. Then we returned in 1980, and I grew up for my first 16 years of life, basically, in the dictatorship. So I grew up. I was born into the dictatorship, and that I lived through that until I was roughly 17 or 16 or 17, right? So I lived 16 years of dictatorship, which, obviously, not obviously. It's hard to explain to people that it was very normal to me at the time, very normal, everything that happened, that there was curfews and, protests and people bleeding from their heads. And, you kind of, leave it as a normal reality at the time. And then when you take distance from it, you're like, whoa, that was insane. But, I also had friends and we played and, we were kids too. So then, we had the whole process. I lived 16 years of dictatorship, and then the next 16 years that I lived in Chile were the transition, right? In which we were told, well, now, we switch back to a political democratic system of, party, alternation, that, no, that people take turns, that parties take turns ruling or something. But basically, the model of truth and reconciliation that was offered to us was based on the model of South Africa after apartheid. But basically, we traded to have democracy at the expense of having justice, right? We were like, okay, you can have democracy, but all the people that did this human rights violation, they're going to go home. And we had a Truth and Reconciliation report that came out that only named the victims and what happened to them in detail, right? So the truth that we were confronted with was also the truth of the victims, but we were never allowed to know the identity of the perpetrators of the violence. So during the transition, things like this would happen. Somebody would go to line up at a superstore and all of a sudden look in front of them and recognize the person that tortured them was like in front of them buying bread, right? Or somebody would go to the hospital and recognize the doctor that was present during their torture. So the transition was with this weird thing in which we kept Pinochet's constitution, which, organized all the neoliberal system, the private education, private health, private pensions, private highways, private everything, And we were offered this narrative that, no, now we're in democracy and free market. And, we can do whatever you want. You can buy Pepsi or Coke. We have all these alternatives. But we didn't have, and then the victims of violence were offered reparations that were actual money pockets. So the transition looked like something like the quantification of how much of a victim you were, okay, and then how much you deserve to be repaired. So somebody like my cousin who wasn't even born when his dad went missing and was never found, he was like, well, you can take that money and, he was like, I don't want to touch that money. That money disgusts me. It's an insult that they're trying to throw that money at me. Especially when the person that disappeared, his dad or my uncle, it's still walking freely. So when I left Chile during this, weird reconciliation, state-imposed reconciliation, okay, now we have this report of truth and reconciliation, so now that's in the past. Look, we're going to make a memorial here and another memorial there. We're going to make these monuments that mark that this thing is in the past, right? Which is not true. Because all the violence that was put in place, the structural violence that was put in place through the dictatorship, is still operating, because the violence of the human rights violations were never fully acknowledged. So that's still violence. It's still violent that so many people don't have a place to go visit their dead because they don't. They don't. There's nothing. So the violence continues, but the gesture, which I find it's a sort of like a rationalization of the violence, right? And this, movement of saying that things are in the past and not in the present. So now we have to move on and look to the future in which we're all united and have grown out of this divisive past, right? So if anybody is trying to bring up anything around that in Chile, it's like, why do you want to put your finger in the wound? Diane Nelson, who studied this in sort of violence in Guatemala, she has an article called The Finger in the Wound, because they talk about it in the same way. It's like, why would you want to put the finger in the wound, right? And we've covered it so nicely with this brand new Band-Aid, right? And then I moved to Canada, right? And so it's really interesting because I came to live here, and I come here with the same kind of like settler narrative that most of your ancestors, if you're a white settler, came here with, right? I came here looking for a better opportunity and a better life for me and my children and what have you. And I wasn't going to have children in Chile, that was for sure. Chile was never a homely or safe place for me. It was a site of terror and trauma. And so I moved here, and then I found myself put in a place where the state is also asking us to reconcile, and it's asking us to move forward, and it's asking us to leave our dead behind, right? Which is something that I still struggle with the case of Chile, because our dead is not just that, 4,000 people or whatever were killed. A whole project, a whole dream, a whole conception of society and human relations was disappeared with them, right? So I want to claim those dead in the sense I want to claim that project. It's not gone, right? And when I think about it here, it's complicated because, again, I'm here as a settler, as a racialized settler, but as a settler too. And, moving to Saskatoon also, it's, I become implicated in processes of like gentrification and further indigenous, marginalization and so on. So I take this idea of reconciliation, it's a very complex for me, because I then go back to Chile and I think, well, have I reconciled with the indigenous people of Mica, So I keep going in circles, from that starting point of me in Chile to being here, and then what does the process that I'm leading through here of reconciling or decolonizing or whatever we want to frame that as, it's also having me ask, well, but what about in Chile? Like, what about colonization in Chile? Because I was only taught about the violence of imperialism, right? But it's an older problem, but it's still there and still operating. So I feel like reconciliation and repair, in a very weird way, have like always been around me and structured the context in which I'm operating. But I'm always kind of like resisting the idea that we can't reconcile. We can't, like, how are we, in the case of Chile, it's obvious, right? So how are we supposed to reconcile about crimes that, the person that committed the crime has not even, like, been acknowledged, right? And then I have a perspective for understanding the process here, right? Like, well, are we naming the institutions that continue to do the colonial violence? Are we naming the people that is reproducing the colonial violence? Is it only the past, right? Is this like another thing that we can just make a memorial and say this happened in the past and it's very shameful? But how does it relate to the present, right? And how do we carry our dead here too, right? How do we carry the dead of the people that died in residential schooling or in, in just, like, how do we move forward without having to leave them behind? I don't know if it makes sense. It does? Okay. So that's all I'm going to say for now, and thank you.
Well, thank you to Manuela. And I'm just going to invite Amanda to follow on, and then we'll kind of go from there. So, but I was holding on to this to say, but I'll just say it now too, that it's not a small thing to invite people to speak biography and context and story. And so to acknowledge to all of you, we've welcomed you, but to welcome you again as you're sharing your stories, that, it's biography and context for all of us. And so we've invited you to be conversation starters, and so I want to acknowledge that again. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here, and so looking forward to learning alongside all of you. And it's just such an honor to be on this panel with such incredible women advocates and to hear your stories. My background is that I come from British descent, and my ancestors were migrants who came to Canada seeking economic prosperity. And it was as I grew and learned, began to realize that my privileges came at the expense of others' pain and of violence. And through working in community and being led by elders and receiving community education, my neighbors teaching me along the way, realizing that my liberation is bound up in the liberation of my neighbors. And I identify as a settler ally. My faith has motivated my social justice work, and although I've worked mainly in a secular context until now, I'm very grateful the Mennonites have adopted me, and very grateful to be at MCC. As I was reflecting on this question, I guess I geeked out a little bit because I started thinking about theories of social change and how that informs our approach. As we understand social change, it so often starts with a radical idea or practice that's held by outliers. And over time, adherents start to adopt the radical idea or the practice. And ultimately, there's enough adherence behind this idea or practice that you have a critical mass, and it becomes the norm. It becomes a dominant idea or practice. And another thing we understand about social change is the interplay between culture shifting and rules or systems shifting. And oftentimes as advocates, or at least I'll speak for myself, we're always so quick to just rush and say we need to change this law, this policy, this system needs to change. And history's taught us, and this theory has taught us, how crucial it is for culture to shift, for people's hearts and minds and attitudes to shift in the direction of where we want our systems, our laws and policies to be shifting as well. Or else the public, our culture, will reject those systems changes. They'll see them as delegitimate, and they won't be effective or sustainable, and we'll go back to the status quo. And certainly this is an intertwined process, because as our culture shifts, and that supports changes to our systems, rules, and policies, then that creates more dialogue around those changes. People start thinking, talking, relating to each other, and then that promotes culture shifting. So the two are so intertwined. So thinking about these theories of social change as they pertain to this work of reconciliation that we're engaged in, this radical idea of just relations and land justice between settlers and Indigenous peoples is longstanding, from the earliest days of Indigenous resistance. And it's slowly over time attracted more and more adherents. And I'd like to, although just recently admitted to my Pollyanna-esque tendencies, but I'd like to believe we're actually approaching an era of critical mass around some of these ideas. I think about the 90s and the great work of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. Excellent work done, and bold, significant recommendations coming out of that work, and yet little follow-up, little uptake. And here we are in 2018, and TRC has mobilized. It's created this momentum. People are listening, people are acting, people are coming together in a multi-sectoral way, like in our government agencies, in our schools, in nonprofit, in our churches, and saying, how do we respond to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work? How do we respond to their calls to action? And it's an exciting time. I want to believe that we're in this era where we're getting toward this critical mass around these radical ideas. When I think about the reconciliation work that's being done in Saskatoon, this is a community where I do my work, much of the discussion is around education and relationship building. And of course, that's crucial for the culture shifting that we need to support the systems and policy changes. It promotes changes in public attitudes around equality and inclusion for Indigenous peoples by breaking down racial stereotypes, belying assumptions, cultivating empathy, identifying common humanity and our shared destiny, and more. And this is vital work that MCC engages in. our staff and I get to do anti-racism education and the blanket exercise. We also bring Indigenous and settler folks together and engage in shared initiatives with Indigenous neighbors toward reconciliation efforts. But despite this rightful focus on education and relationship building, we can't forget justice. And this is what I'm hearing too from the panelists here, that relationship is a first step. Relationship is a first step, and that meaningful justice, meaningful reparations for historical wrongs, and the acknowledgement of the ongoing violence of colonialism and how to be shifting, how to be changing, how to be curbing those forces it's crucial. I think about the beautiful story of the young Chippewayan First Nation and the Mennonite and Lutheran farmers in the Laird area that some of you may be familiar with, and if you aren't, I'll sort of just give a thumbnail sketch, is that the young Chippewayan First Nation had designated land called Reserve 107 that was in the Laird area here in Saskatchewan. But because of starvation, the young Chippewayans were forced to other areas to find food and didn't settle on the land. And so the government gave that land to Mennonite and Lutheran farmers who farm there today. And young Chippewayan Indigenous folks just live in the diaspora. They don't have land of their own. And as they organized and leaders went back to their original land and started speaking to the farmers and said, this was our land, a lot of the farmers became afraid and defensive. But over time, they cultivated a relationship with each other. And ultimately, they signed a memorandum of understanding. They made an agreement with each other to say, we are going to work towards justice, land justice for what happened to the young Chippewayans. And the farmers began supporting the young Chippewayans' land claim with the government, raising funds for a genealogy, for example. But they've also said to themselves, should we wait for the government to bring justice, and are working on creating a land trust so that the farmers can be giving land and funds and so on for the young Chippewayan to have their ancestral lands. And so that's an example of relationship being crucial and being a gateway, and land justice being the meaningful reparation that needs to happen there, that our Indigenous neighbors are asking us to support them in. And that's why justice is so important, is because the voices of Indigenous people are saying it's not enough. There was a wonderful interview on CBC's Unreserved. An Indigenous woman was being interviewed, and she's like, reconciliation to me, I'm a little discouraged by it. I think about this example. Let's say you steal my truck, and I see you driving all over the community in my truck, and I'm walking or hitchhiking and feeling kind of aggrieved by this, maybe more than a little aggrieved. And then you stop on the side of the road and get out of the truck and say, I stole your truck and I'm sorry. Thank you for acknowledging that wrong. And then you get back in the truck and drive away. And this is why justice is so important, right? I need my truck back. Or buy me a new truck. Or let's figure out some way to repair this wrong. And that's what justice is about. And so we need to start with education and relationship building, and we need to ensure that we move from there to advocating for systems changes, for effective, sustainable change to happen. And so the questions that I want to ask myself and encourage us to think about as Christians who are engaged in reconciliation and see ourselves largely as settler allies, what is the role of the church and us as Christians in this justice work? One of the challenges that Reconciliation Saskatoon is facing is how do we engage the apathetic? Here we are around this circle, and we're kind of preaching to the choir. Like, everyone's here because they care and they want to do the work. How do we engage people who, it's not on their radar, it's not on their heart? And how do we as Christians leverage our sphere of influence? We are connected to congregations, we're connected to communities. And how can we educate and facilitate relationship building opportunities and mobilize Christians to engage in justice advocacy? How do we leverage the public perception that we as a church have a moral voice, that we're a conscience in society? And how can we challenge ourselves just to show up and do the work? And then a last sort of question or challenge that I have for myself is how, as Christian allies and advocates, how do we hold both the recognition of our participation in oppression of Indigenous peoples with solidarity, with Indigenous equity and inclusion?
So thank you, Amanda, and again to Janelle and Manuela. And so we're starting a conversation, and it's a conversation that we're all already in. So each of us who've spoken here and everyone here, we're already engaged in conversation. We're having conversation about repair, about reconciliation, about social change, about decolonization, about relationship, about impossibility, about the global realities, local realities, land, ourselves, and so thank you again to say that there's a lot. If we're going to have this conversation, there's going to be a lot on our minds. There's going to be a lot in our hearts. There's going to be a lot of places. There's and connections and that's where we are and what we're engaged in. So this is a start into something we're already in, and I really thank you for speaking to an audience in this way too. And so I'll invite you to stay here for a bit because what we'll do is this is also an opportunity for you to share with each other. So what I'd like you to do, we'll just take probably about 10 minutes. And if you can find a group of 3 people sort of nearby you. So as we've acknowledged, we've all come here because we care. We're drawn to this topic. We're drawn to being here, to having some conversation. And we also come from different places. We've got, our communities, we have our histories, our biographies. And so just to invite you to have a little conversation together as we come into this time of reflection. And also, if you'd prefer not to talk and you just want to kind of think or write, you can just signal that to the people around you. Some people like to process more in that way. So have a conversation or do some writing and thinking. So what experiences and questions do you bring? So we're having this conversation: repair, reconciliation, social change, decolonization, relationship, ourselves. What are your questions and experiences? What do you suggest or think we might keep in mind over the next few days? So that's a starting off point. And if you might go somewhere else in the conversation. But so what are your experiences and questions? Where do you think we might go? So we'll take about 10 minutes and invite you to kind of just stay where you are and talk to the folks around you or write, and then we'll call you back together. But before we do that, I just was going to ask if any of the 3 of you wanted to add a little before. We're good? Okay. All right. So 10 minutes. What do you bring? Start the